games in which what we ordinarily call game mastering is a distributed process, particularly when turn order is involved. And that's kind of what I want to focus on today, because I'm specifically using this kind of technique for Cosmic Zap, and I want to investigate exactly what I'm doing with it. That in my experience, the first game that I encountered that very aggressively said, we are going to have game mastering, but we're not going to have a game master, was Ferry Basilman's Soap, which I think is dated to 1999 or 2000 in its very first form. It was published by Impressions a while later, but I mean, when it first was like a Forge, a Forge text file or something awful like that, so that. So I don't know. Gordon, do you remember Soap?
Oh yeah, I remember Soap. Hmm? I don't remember if it was the one that was GeoCities or not, but that we had a couple that were GeoCities.
There were, yeah. It was something like that. So Manu, do you remember it at all?
I've heard of it, but I've never looked at it or anything. So, yeah.
And Herman and Ahel, have you ever heard of Soap? No.
I saw it, but it's not. It didn't stuck at this point. So.
Well, I was talking in the Patreon about how I was going to talk about Universalis, and then I remember playing in that game of Soap with Mike Holmes. And then when Mike started working with Ralph, then things became, it was clear that Soap had made a really big impression on him. The way it worked was that everybody made up a soap opera character. And as I recall, there wasn't that much thought given to the setting. You basically just went with whatever we all did. And each character, had like a secret, and it was very simple. The way it worked, though, was that a given person would simply start making life difficult for another character. And then that person had to play their character in the midst of it. And I don't remember all the details, but the resolution mechanism wasn't very dicey, wasn't very task resolution, and might even have involved some kind of currency, some moving coins around or tokens. Not certain if that was the case or whether there was some kind of dice off. But there was a mechanism for your character getting killed, and if your character was killed, you continued to play because you could still be, one of them. When you made life difficult for another character, you could still do that. So everybody could GM, and you took turns in some way. It was also pretty unconstructed in terms of what could happen if somebody pulls a gun out of their purse or something. They just do. So it was incredibly, loosey-goosey, incredibly wide open in terms of what would happen. It was completely ridiculous. It all turned into everybody shooting each other all the time, and everybody just kind of got giddy with the fact that, oh, I get to go, oh, I get to be GM, okay, wow, you, are in this kitchen when you show up, and, someone else at the table got to do that next time. In 1999, 2000, that was, to us, I think, completely amazing. And I'm trying to think, can anyone think of anything before that? There must have been. I'm probably just spacing and walking right over it in my mind.
Well, I think the thing that you kind of rightly identify as very different is the real turn-based nature of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can remember doing all kinds of strange things with shared GMing and shifting GMing and things. I can't remember how much of it was in a game and how much was it from anywhere, but it was very... it was tied to, okay, I'll come up with a setting and then you take over the plot, or,
right.
It wasn't like a procedure of turn.
Right. It seemed to be more of I remember it as a session thing.
Yeah, or
You
even
could
just within a session, it wasn't back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Right, and definitely, as I recall, like there would sometimes be like a villain GM in Champions, and I swiftly realized I didn't like that because I liked playing the villains better than anything else. So I gave up my favorite thing, and so I got rid of doing that. But the important thing about that was that there was still GM people and players with their characters. It was still very separate. The idea that you could be playing a character in an invested way, and then, oh, my turn? Oh, okay, I'll GM now. And then you would go back. That, I think, was new. The games that were widely considered at that time really like the wacky games, the freaky games, included The Window by Scott Linenger, if I remember correctly, and also Theatrix, which was slightly older. And there are a couple of others too, but all of them had your standard Game Master situation.
Looking back, way back, but it's sort of more was doing things like Dungeons and Dragons without a dungeon master, just using tables and random encounters and
right.
a predefined map where you had, you kept yourself on the your little group of people, because there were days when we had just 2 or 3 players and no game master or no dungeon master, and we played. Well, we did want to play because we want to play our characters.
Right.
So. Yeah, you rolled up from we're here at this city. Oh yeah, this city. We have a shared world map, and then rolled random encounters as you went along and had some fun for a couple of hours. And that's sort of
that raises any number of sort of existential questions about whether you needed a game master in the first place. But that opens another interesting door in the conversation.
But it's more like, well, that's earlier than what you mentioned, but was more spontaneous and
right.
inspired by the random tables in, I think, the AD&D Dungeon Master Guide, first edition one.
It's a really interesting tweak of the available materials. The idea that a person would actually take on Dungeon Master responsibilities that are associated with being the Dungeon Master. And then doing those and then give them up to another person in a very temporary or short-term way. That's still not in there, but you can see the tools are there, Yeah. So there's
we're ramping up towards more tooling and more structure.
The structure of Universalis, which I think was sort of the named game that everybody participating in the independent design community was reading and then would spin off of, was Universalis. And I, in retrospect, am a little shocked at how much it is a much more formalized version of SOAP. The very same notion that when it was your turn, it wasn't your turn to play your character. This was often misplayed. When people sat down to play Universalis like at a con, they said, oh, it's my turn. Okay, my guy's here and he's doing this. And that's exactly the opposite of what you do. You address things that are going on that you want to have happen if another person's player character is involved. Then they start playing as if they were inside the fiction, in character, basically. Which also was the opposite of what people said, that in Universalis you don't get to play characters. And I was like, what are you talking about? They were doing something else at the table, that not in the rules. But the rules had it that, say I was my turn in Universalis, this is not like SOAP, and I didn't feel like any of your characters or anybody's character was interesting at all, because they're just more units and components on this table in front of us. There's hundreds of things out there by now, and I want to have things go happen over at the Pirate Cove, and I just start saying what happens over at the Pirate Cove. And it isn't unless somebody buys in, with or without buying in their character, paying for something on the table that is now theirs and is in my scene, only then can they start acting with agency inside that scene and start saying, prompting things like a fictional conflict. If that doesn't happen, people can still challenge what I'm saying, but that's at the meta player level where you bid against what I said happened, rather than inside the fiction of components battling it out based on their attributes. So technically speaking, you could play and nobody would ever have a player character. We would all just do that all the time. But as it happened, people would buy into the having a player character, in which case, whenever it got roped into a scene, they had to direct that character's actions. So that's kind of the way it worked out in Universalis. After that, things blew wide open. After that, it was almost like relationship maps. If you were writing a new game, people would ask, "Where's the relationship map?" If you were writing a new game, people were saying, "Well, why do you need a GM? You can do it, with all these." And the terminology went left and right. People kept calling them GM-less. And that led, I think, was it Gordon? Do you remember? It was Emily Kerboss who started saying, she started using the term, GM full instead.
Yeah.
And which, of course, we all adopted that. We were like, that's exactly what we mean. There's no one GM, but there's GMing all the time. And then I started doing this thing about the GM tasks. And I only said I'm only using that term for historical reasons. We don't have a good term, but there are these tasks that have to get done. And, when you start and stop scenes, when do you say, the ninja jump in through the window and stuff like that. People have to do things like that. I was kind of interested in what games people might have brought that had that sort of thing in it. Mm-hmm. So, anything?
Well, I brought Follow by Ben Robbins.
Okay, so you take.
Oh wait, I can.
No. My news first.
I have a few others. Don't worry.
That's right. My news first.
I can do Microscope instead on Hell.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
I have two others.
Yeah. We've kind of beaten Microscope into the ground with a sledgehammer through the course of these seminars too. So we can include it in a bit. So tell me about Follow.
So Follow, like a lot of GM lists or GM full games, has the beginning phase where you all decide kind of first, Follow is designed to be a quest game. So everybody is going on a quest. Kill the dragon, right? Do a bank heist, something like that. And he has lists of different quests and different challenges for each quest. And there's one player, and it proceeds in a series of challenges. So suppose we're going to go kill the dragon. That's the overall quest. Then on the way to kill the dragon, you have several challenges, 3 challenges. And I think the third challenge determines whether we actually succeed in achieving the quest. So the first, players take turns in picking the challenge. So player, suppose it's Angel's turn, he picks a challenge, and then each player takes a turn in framing a scene about that challenge. And each scene is, there's no task resolution, there's not even any scene resolution. Mm-hmm. People have total control over what happens to their character. And you have 2 characters, a major and a minor character. And the scene framer decides when it starts and ends. And then there's a resolution after everyone has had framed a scene and a scene has been framed. Then there's a resolution using it says it's called stones, but it could be dice or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Tokens, some kind of right, yeah. And then there's at the very end, after everyone has framed a scene, then you determine whether that challenge has been overcome, overcome, and or not, and also if a character is lost.
So let me get back up again, because I'm kind of feeling very what, if I may use the term, old school all of a sudden. The fellow who framed the scene, or person who framed the scene, decides when it stops, and they decide whether it's been overcome. Same person?
No.
Okay.
There is no scene resolution.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but the word I want to say is overcoming the challenge. Who does that again?
You draw.
You draw
to determine whether the challenge has been. So that's random. That's where the randomness comes in.
Yeah,
this kind of sounds like resolution to me. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, what I mean is, it's not individual task resolution.
Right. Okay.
There's no role to see. Okay, my character escaped the bear or something.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah.
The only thing that there is that when you describe what your character does, another player can say, yes, but like introduce a complication. That's all they can do. They cannot. They introduce complications. It has a name.
Consequences.
Right, consequences. Yeah. All right, so this actually does sound, but then for like the next, I don't know if it's the next challenge. Is it the same person who frames?
No, then the next person takes a turn and says, okay, this is the challenge. And actually, they don't frame the scene. The next person on the left, I think, will frame the first scene of the challenge.
Right.
So,
The interesting stuff that happens with those tokens is that at the end of each scene or challenge, I don't remember, each player
challenge.
Okay, challenge. Each player says, ask himself, do I think we advance our objective in the quest? And also another question, do I think we are acting together as a group, maybe, or something like that? Like, there's two questions like that. Depending on what you answer to that, you put in a bag or a bowl or somewhere where they can see a token of one color or another. And then someone draws two tokens, and depending on the colors that come up, it's basically like a list of things that happen. You do it, but one character die. You don't do it, and one character die. Like a few things like that.
So depending upon how the players feel the game is going, or if they want the quest to succeed, that will influence the chance of the challenge being overcome or not.
Right. Okay, well, now that I get that there is a kind of way to determine the outcome with random elements, and I'm kind of oriented, to get back to the GMing thing, at the end of each challenge, then someone else frames it, right?
Yeah. Frames the new the second challenge. Yeah.
Okay. And then there's only 3 challenges total for a given quest, or
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, but each challenge is a full round of scenes.
Right.
So yeah.
And when you say a round of scenes, does that mean that something shifts around in terms of GMing power? Yeah. Maybe
5 of us were playing.
Right.
I pick a challenge. Angel frames the scene.
So then each of us does that. Yeah.
We play the scene, right. And then after that scene is over, then you frame the scene, and so on. And that's all within one challenge.
Right. You know, Universalis is also similar in this, because you have one person who does what I described, which is kind of set the whole situation of the moment. And then you do go around in contributing, as long as it's not a challenge, which anybody can shout out and pay for. You wait your turn. You can buy anything in Universalis. It's kind of I almost used a bad word. It's a somewhat mercenary game in this regard, where you can like buy yourself into the turn order, ahead of somebody and stuff like that too. But I don't want to go into that. My point is that there is the idea that there's one person who's kind of more equal than others for this round.
Yeah,
You know,
but that's
yeah.
interesting in follow, because in follow, the person who's framing the scene just does that. After that, they just play the card
Right,
if they
right,
happen to be in the scene.
right. There's an interesting feature that's similar in some ways. Well, okay. I'm going to talk about another game that actually doesn't have that one person and then we all go. One person, then we all go, which is Spione, which is also heavily influenced by these games, in that you have it moves to the left, a person either just continues what's happening for one or more situations, maximum of 2 that can be active at a given time, or just decides to close it. So it comes to you. The person who just was sort of setting the last one doesn't decide whether it's closed or not. They're just enjoined to speak briefly, that's all. So now you speak, and you can speak briefly, and if that includes closing the scene, it does. If it includes bringing in someone else, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And then it moves to the next person. So the scenes start and stop. I'm sorry, go ahead, Manu.
Oh, that's okay. Was there any criteria for what counts as briefly?
Yeah, actually, it's much briefer than most people expect. And one of the important things about Spione is that you're not supposed to, quote, drive to conflict. You don't frame a conflict. You don't try to say, how can I make this a conflict or anything like that. And the joke in the game that developed through play was that if it comes to you and you're like, oh my God, all this responsibility, what do I say? What do I say? Just say it's always raining in Berlin. Just say it's raining and let the next person, pick it up. And so that way, you don't, so the idea is to keep it completely mellow, if you will. The intrinsic material is so fraught with betrayal, suspicion, awfulness that enough people will be bringing conflicts in willy-nilly quickly that you should never force it. So therefore, the GMing role in this is actually really elective. The turn order simply keeps mixing it up as to who has contributory power over that kind of thing, but you have no responsibility to do it ever. So it's a very weird version of some of this. And again, the big difference between it and the games that we're talking about so far is that you don't have sort of a one player who's kind of the big one at the moment, and then everybody else does their own thing, their contributory thing in it. When I say the big one, I don't necessarily mean the one who's in charge. I just mean someone who had a particular responsibility, like saying this is the challenge or something like that. Anyway, so anyone else? What?
I got Bjorn's.
Yeah. One of my games to play ASAP list, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
Which is really guiding the group. It starts with there is a host, but that's the role of host, the people
right. You're
the game,
presenting the game, yeah,
presenting the game, hosting the game, getting the people together, etc. If you make characters of the group, you do a number of things. You go to a couple of stages, and then you circle around, if I'm correct, because it's been a while.
There's a fairly few people playing.
Yeah.
As few as 3, I believe. Did he say 4 is optimal? I think.
Yeah, I think 3 or 4.
3 or 4. Yeah, it's a fairly small group thing, and the person, when it moves to sort of the GM person, they've got a whole lot of power going on. Jason likes torturing characters. And
two groups of characters you make.
Yeah, that's right.
Characters on 2 sides. Everyone creates two characters, but not necessarily they're your characters. They're characters for the group. If I remember right. And there's the authority versus the convicts, because it is called it's a prison planet.
You're right.
Kind of setting. So you have the authority with the governor, functionaries, etc. The colonial marines. It's science fiction. And on the other hand, there's the criminal overlords with the whole pyramid beneath that. And you create a number of interesting characters to play and to experience the game with drives, etc. And then see what happens for a number of turns. For
purposes of our topic, one of the important elements is that the person speaking, I guess, whatever we call that person, the speaker of the moment, and I think Jason has a term, you actually put some character into some kind of dreadful situation.
Yeah.
And I was under the impression that implied a particular player. I think don't the people who make those characters up, aren't they? I think they actually own them. I could be corrected about that. But regardless, somebody does. And you can have your character's sort of deepmost motivation or secret or problem that can be broken or resolved or something like that. And characters can also die. So, Herman, I don't mean to step on you. Do you want to talk about how resolution is achieved? Because it's kind of relevant, maybe.
I'm trying to remember. It's set
okay.
Well, pick the book up again after a while and try to remember how did this go again?
Well, there are three corners. There's civility and savagery. Wait, something like that. Security.
Servility, savagery, and drive. And the drive can be safety or
whatever. Right.
That's something you've chosen for the particular scenario.
Yeah. There's three kind of values at work here.
There's always servility and savagery, and the third one is drive, and the drive is for whatever is required by the combination of planet and colony name, I think.
It's arrived at through the course of prep.
Yeah.
But the important thing, though, is that you have a very simple dice off among them and those three values. And in some ways, you basically they're just inspired, almost kind of as a group. There's very much, it's very loosey who says what to determine actually what happens, just being inspired by how the dice came up rather than like looking up a chart or something like that. So in many ways, the creative responsibility, what I call outcome authority in my scheme, isn't there. It's always thrown out to inspiration of the moment based on those dice, but it's not centralized. So the only real, what I'm seeing in all of this is the one consistent thing, or a consistent thing, is either the responsibility or the capacity to say, you are here. A lot of the other authorities bounce around, but that's the one that seems to go from turn to turn.
Yeah, and then there's one more thing. There's the end game, or ending the game, which there were rules for, which is when there are... You have oaths that can be broken and notables that can die.
Right.
And when the number of oaths broken and dead notables is more than the number of players, end game. You have a sort of end game.
Right.
As a host, the one organizing, you're sort of required to keep an eye on. Okay, when's that going to happen? But that's about the only GM full position I can remember for the game. And the organizing and the keep an eye on more procedurally. Are we there yet, or should we keep playing? And
I recall it as very much. I remember reading it and thinking, this is almost too soft for me. There's a whole lot of just now we decide, now we talk, and see how it goes. And my general experience with that kind of mechanic is not favorable. And I talked to Jason about it after that and said, Jason, does this thing really play? do you really actually play? Is this very systemic? I mean, what really is going on here? And he says it is, but that he designed it from the position of he wanted as little. It was minimalist in terms of that. He wanted to see if you could really get to push that sort of consensus-based chit-chat as far as it would go and still be functional. He was kind of aiming for that.
Yeah.
So Ron,
Yeah.
when you say that you had some unfavorable experiences, what did you find happen?
Consensus building, which usually turns into bullying. Even if it's nice bullying, and the person would never think of themselves as such. And when I say the person, I would include a certain person present in the conversation as guilty of that too. So the point being that there are if we look at these different GM tasks, of which there are at least 6 or 7, and I'm not even counting the social ones like hosting and explaining or checking the rules or any of that stuff. That's a whole different realm. But if we look at this procedural, who goes where, what's going on, how does it turn out, sort of a distribution of the authorities in many ways. If we look at games which do it in a non-centralized way, we find that the parts that they throw out for everybody to just contribute freely, the parts that are permitted to do that, it has to be some subset. It can't be all of it. And so when I read Durance, it kind of went over my internal line of how far you can take that. And Jason said, yeah, I was actually pushing it over certain lines, certain tolerance levels to see how much of it I could get away with. But if you look at it, the things that are locked down in terms of those GMing and structural things are very, very locked down. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's not as though Durance has nothing of what we're talking about. It does, but it's highly definite and highly limited in a way, kind of squeezing those so hard that the other things are free to just jump around through whoever says what. Does that make any sense?
I think so.
Yeah. And do you guys see that as with soap as another example? Just how loose your opportunity for narration and introduction of stuff is a big deal. And the dirty secret is that even if you have a completely centralized single GM of the completely familiar stripe, that doesn't change. They too have all this freedom to bring in all this shit. It just feels different when that's distributed outside of one person, and people will start objecting to that power existing at all. When you say, that's funny, you were perfectly fine with exactly the same power when it was Bob by himself. Why is Bob special? If Bob's good at it, how come, why aren't we all good at it? And I remember asking that question 15, 18 years ago. And really, that stung people a lot. That really stung them. There was this notion that everybody but Bob, should they be handed such ability, would misuse it. Even if they wouldn't misuse it if they had it like Bob had it in their game.
Yeah.
But somehow, if it was distributed, right? If exactly, but if it was distributed and we actually saw it appear and disappear among us, that somehow that would be bad. That the power would be bad or misused or go out of control or something like that. And so, and that's where the GM-less, GM-full discussion came from, was to try to develop some kind of vocabulary that it was all the same damn thing, that distribution of it had its own properties that you may or may not want in play. As a contrast, it occurred to me when we were talking, and I was thinking of some of the more aggressive game designers we have around, historically. Jared Sorensen sticks pretty much with basic GMing. Even in a game as wide open and wild in terms of what you can say as Octane, there's a game master. If I'm remembering correctly, pretty sure that there is.
Yep.
And you know, Lacuna, Inspectors, the works, the centralization of a great deal of that is important in his games, or at least almost all the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. So it's kind of interesting to realize that making things GM-ful and splitting it up and moving it around, that's actually a fairly trivial rather than, you know, deeply challenging aspect of role-playing. It certainly has properties, and a single person doing it has its own properties, but none of it is none of it, I mean, and really none of it had any of those terrifying qualities that we all thought it would have. You know,
yeah, it's interesting. I think when I think back, you know, there was a category of play that I think that I did for decades that had lots of implicit GM-fulness to it.
Mm-hmm.
But making it explicit in any way was definitely forbidden. It was perfectly okay that, yeah, everybody knows that we start, you know, doing stuff in the mountains, and then the guy who knows about mountains is going to take over a lot of GM stuff about it. That just happened, and it was okay. But if it was somehow procedural, okay, you're the GM now, then that was more of an issue for some reason.
The same thing goes with saying what's present. You know, I pick up the crowbar.
Yeah.
And, you know, somebody would, and as opposed to saying, is there a crowbar?
Exactly.
Right. There was that sort of thing could get going in groups, and it would be jarring to people who weren't used to it, but then they would realize that it was no big deal. I mean, what was the GM going to say? No, in this garage, you know.
Yeah.
Somewhat more aggressive was what we found in Sorcerer, which was the characters were so proactive that the players were effectively scene framing when they say what their character would go do. Because if the player said, you know, I'm going over to that house, you know, it's not like the GM said, well, no, you can't go over to that house, you know.
Right.
And so technically that happens in other games, or it's available in other games, but in practice, people rarely exhibited that kind of directorial power of, okay, this scene is in the house now. You know, we're there. What do we, you know, what happens? Yeah,
even though I know I have done that a fair amount, it is also really easy if somebody, you know, does assert that I'm the GM to just stop doing that because, oh, okay, they're the GM, they're going to be in charge of that.
Right. Self-censoring yourself about that is more common. I found it to be common. So okay, then we take a look at some of the other games that have messed with this, and I'm trying to think if really, are we talking about a boring technique? If I do say so, Spiono went a different direction. So we'll, at the risk of saying mine is special, let's leave that one out and say, are we talking about something that's basically like fairly trivial and has properties, but it really isn't that hard to understand, really isn't that hard to do, and doesn't have that many interesting properties relative to ordinary GMing?
I mean, I think the issue is thinking that either of them is special. Mm-hmm. Like that either of them is the definitive way of doing it. I think you can consider. I think as you said back in the day, there's these tasks that more or less need to be done by someone at some point, and how you distribute them is like that's up to the game. There's nothing special, and it'll have some properties how you do it, but there's nothing special to the idea of having just a single GM,
Right.
and there's nothing special
About having lots of them. Yeah.
or none or whatever.
Yeah. Right. It's kind of the difficulty, of course, is when we say nothing special. There's several different ways that can be interpreted. One is talking about socially privileged.
That's
right, and that's the main one that we were shooting in the head. That was the sacred cow.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. That's the one that I had to talk about this. Like, yeah. I think I will like add to that so not to make people angry like that. Like this property.
Make them angry. I know. Who cares?
Like having just one GM could be useful for your particular game because that's the design and it fits into the design. Or having none or having it shared around could be useful and cool for another game for other reasons. But there's nothing like inherently special to either.
Right, and I agree. So we're talking now about technique, not about social privilege or things like that.
I mean, if we want to get into that, I have an entire presentation about that. I can go hard on that.
Okay, well, go ahead.
So sorry. So one of the main thing I found is that it's not that the GM full games are technically more difficult to understand for players. It's that sometimes it can be intimidating for a new player. Like sometimes, especially if you haven't played before and it's like, okay, it's your turn to frame a scene. A lot of times with beginning players, you get the kind of deer in the headlights look, like, oh my God. Yeah, it's like too much responsibility. So it's not, the problem hasn't been like a difficulty in understanding the technicalities of it. It's been more of this kind of almost a fear of a fear of the power of the responsibility. Does that make any sense?
It does, although as usual, I have footnotes.
And sometimes people also just are less good at it. I mean, I've played quite a bit of Primitive Adventures, for example, with a group of friends, a small group of friends, and usually the 3 or 4 of us, and me and some other person are pretty good at it, and the other one just doesn't prefer that kind of stuff. So in the end, we just went back to Dungeon World and things like that. Because he felt more, he was happier playing that way because it was not his thing to have that kind of improvisational thing happen in his role playing.
Right. I've encountered the same thing just in terms of people's personal tastes. Yeah. But I was also, my one footnote that I had to what you were saying, Manu, is that I'm not sure if it's necessarily people who are new to role playing. The most difficulty I've observed is people who are very accustomed to a particular way. But that's right. That's not a big. I'm not objecting to anything else you said. I was just kind of a footnote.
That might also be the case in my group, because the one having problems was the one who I've been playing role playing games with since my late teens. So
right.
Sure.
And again, I'm not going to challenge anybody's preferences in that regard. I mean, So Gordon, go ahead.
I was going to say, some of the games. So I am definitely crippled in this conversation from having played very few of these, GM full games or multi-GM games or whatever. But one that I had played a little bit, and the one that I brought was 1001 Nights.
Oh, right.
Where it's almost designed to make that process of sharing the responsibility going around easier. It's almost a teaching tool, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're in the game, you're telling stories, and so you're meant to be more comfortable about, okay, you're the GM. It's your turn to tell the story. You're the GM now.
Yeah, because you're playing a character who's telling the other character's stories.
Exactly.
Right.
And so I think even Universalis in some ways was almost a teaching tool for getting people who were stuck in certain patterns of how of thinking of things getting out.
It was definitely, we used it as such.
Yeah.
You know, now, break up your assumptions. You might like it, you might not like it. Your learning curve might be awfully weird, but you'll come away and quit harping on us about what real role playing means. It says role and it says playing, so playing a character, and we're like, oh, shut up, go play Universalis, you know. But not that we say you like it or that it's a better game or more role playing than what you like, but just get that isness out of there. You know, it doesn't have to have staples in the back and be 28 pages long to be a comic book.
Yeah. So I think our expectation would be nowadays you don't need to do that so much. How helpful is it in the design of the game to encourage everybody to do the things that you want them to be able to do? And I think that's a criteria that will, vary by individuals across games, but also probably, better games will make that easier.
One variable that crops up that occurs to me, and I can see now that we've actually addressed it so far per game, is how much are we talking about per person? How much input, how much framing, how long does this role last, and about what? In other words, if the extreme form would be, okay, I'm GM for this session. It's just like any other role-playing game. It's just that this session I'm the GM and next session you will be, but other than that, there's no difference. And so substantially, most of play is exactly what everybody's used to all the time. That would be like the most extreme version on one end. The most extreme version on the other end, okay.
Las Vegas does that.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, and a very early example where that's at least an option, a recommended option, is Prince Valiant, back from 1989. It's not like the canonical rules, that you learn when you read the book all the way through, but after a while it says, okay, now that play has started, do it this way. It's fun. The other far extreme is certainly, in my experience, is Spione, where what you actually do when you have that role is extremely elective and is actually recommended to be trivial as the default. And so the easiest thing to do when you are, quote, the GM is just to describe a detail of the scene that's currently ongoing anyway. Nobody's given a reaction shot for, that character. Just, that character, stops while they're drinking their tea and stares over the edge of the cup for a second at what just happened. Okay, next person. And so then, but on the other hand, you can take it all the way up to the extreme GMing kind of authority if that's what you're inclined to do at that time when it comes to you. So Spione is very, very loose and easy about how much you have to contribute and about what, permitting it to be extremely minimal. Whereas something, and it's fleeting. It's 30 seconds, 45 seconds maximum.
How do you find that affects play compared to some of the other games?
One of the most important things about Spione is how organically the conflicts arise. And another thing that's kind of fun about it is that there's literally no way to tell when the scene is going to shift to somewhere else. And so, the difficulty of the learning curve is getting people to realize that they can be incredibly relaxed about that. Especially with all these other games where the intensity of, okay, frame the scene, name the protagonist, what's the conflict, kind of the way to play Primetime Adventures that I find the least fun, which is this aggressive, you're cutting the scene before you even introduce it, kind of way to play. And and I find I got tired of that after a bit. It's frenetic, and the conflicts become less interesting because they're so urgent and there's no build up and they come out of nowhere. People start making them up completely arbitrarily because they feel that desperation you were talking about. And pretty soon you're just dealing with a whole bunch of characters running around stabbing each other with scissors and shit like that, And so Therefore, yeah, somebody thinks I'm funny out there, someone. And so so therefore in Spiona, once people kind of got used to it, and and you see, and again, it's the non-gamers, or the non-experienced role players who tend to be real easy with it, and you suddenly have these conflicts that are really justified based on what happened, and yet nobody could see that they were coming until just beforehand. And so it has kind of a smooth river feel to it. The river is wide, the river is slow, and yeah, we really should have realized we were about to hit the rapids, but we didn't, and it's more fun that way. So I was designing toward that end, and I'm not saying that the GM-ful thing. Well, yeah, the extreme version, not the full, but the sort of turn-by-turn version. That was the problem with SOAP. That was the problem with Universalis. That's the problem with a few other games of this kind, where you feel this urgent need to frame a conflict. Mm-hmm. That, you get that the narrative falls apart and things just become frenetic, and something has to happen. Jesus is coming. Look busy. Do something.
Well, and in the context of this, that's just one thing that a GM does.
Right.
So if you give somebody, I'm thinking back to our primetime adventure game at Gen Con all those years ago.
Yeah.
There is, the players have the ability to start a scene. And, I had the thought, I wanted to...
Oh, right. Sorry.
I got to take off. I have to be patient.
Well, I see.
Kind of important.
Right. No problem. Cool. And thanks for contributing. It's wonderful to meet you.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So go ahead, Gordon.
There's something going on where you see, okay, I want to do something GM-y now.
Well, it's kind of tricky, Gordon.
But the only tool you have is, I can open a scene. I can start a conflict.
Actually, Gordon, though, in Primetime Adventures, the GM actually frames the scene. The player says what kind of scene they want.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then location is actually someone else's problem.
Yeah,
as I recall.
The details of how that breaks down, I think it is more limited in Primetime Adventures than in some of these other ones.
But people play Primetime Adventures the way you're talking about.
Yeah,
that does happen.
Or even if they don't, I mean, it's a pretty blunt tool. A lot of the GM tool checks.
Right. And the GM.
I remember our game is I had this idea of we're in the park and there's a unicorn.
Right.
Pulling one carriage.
Right.
Like, I got to make that a scene. I got to make that a conflict. And you as GM just said, okay, no, it's there. It's done. It's over.
Right. It was a contribution,
it didn't need to be.
Right.
And so that can maybe be one of the issues with trying to get people involved in this is understanding what exactly is the contribution, what exactly is the fictional format to it, what is the player-to-player conflict, what do you need to do?
And as we have seen, instructions about that can be overridden at the table because people, quote, know how to play an indie game and just do that weird thing,
Right.
So anyway, that's... I don't want to lose the thread. We've talked about Follow. We've talked about Spiona and Universalis and SOAP, which are kind of what I was thinking. I have one more in mind. Herman, you were talking about Durance.
Yep.
And Gordon, what did...
The only one I mentioned was 1001 Nights.
1001 Nights, right. Let's stick with that one for just a little bit because in many ways it's a very soft game. There's very easy in terms of what happens, very easy. It has certain qualities back to the old Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which also should be mentioned in this regard, now that I think about it. But especially in terms of sort of the veracity and the meaning of the stories. But what's interesting about 1001 Nights, it's a competitive game. In the long run, the choices you made tactically and what you did with your story and what the other characters or other players thought of it and stuff like that, there's actually a win condition. It's kind of an interesting, you're reading it and you're going, oh, wait a minute. There's an objective here, right? That's kind of an objective that's zero sum. If I win, you don't. And it's kind of an interesting, it's not what people expect from a Meg Baker game. It's not what you expect from, I don't actually have that opinion, but if one thinks that there's something, what's the word I want? Stereotypically weakly soft in anything Meg does, then they've got the wrong person in mind.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't she on the cover of the latest Apocalypse World as well?
Is she?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's one of the co-authors of Apocalypse World.
Right. So I would say that we've got a couple of variables that we've uncovered that are, kind of interesting to contemplate. Angel.
So
what was your...
I could talk. I have a few I could talk about. I could talk about this one, Lovecraft-esque.
Right.
It's a GM-less Lovecraft-style mystery thing. I could talk about Hot Guys Making Out, but I've talked about that a little bit already here. And I could talk about, I remember this, I could talk about The King is Dead, the new Maggie Vincent's game, which is also GM-less, and it's designed to be easy to learn. So really, I don't know. What are you feeling?
I'm kind of curious. Well, as long as Meg's getting featured, why not? Right? Let's go with let's go with The King is Dead.
The King is Dead is
the Bakers are all over this discussion because Vincent was a player in that Primetime Adventures game. Anyway.
So yeah, The King is Dead uses the same system as a previous game they did called Firebrands. And they have another one with fairies that is also out there somewhere in the future.
Firebrands was the one that came with the little playbooks.
Yes.
Yeah, I have that. Yeah.
The mecha teenage romance thing.
Right.
So this is the same system or very similar. So in this game, it's about kind of Game of Thrones style. The king is dead. He has no clear
succession.
Next in line, and so different houses are going to fight for the throne, and you play one of the not necessarily the heir of the house, but a member of a house trying to get their house elected to be the king, the elected. So yeah, you start by picking your house. There's like a few of them. Then you create a few details about your character, and then basically you start playing. The play goes as such. When it's your turn, you select one game. There's a list of games, and there's things like having a dance, going to war, dueling someone, having an intimate moment with someone, these kind of things, and each game has its own rules, and it tells you what to do. Basically, it's like their own mini game, and kind of above that, at least in the latest version, each character I think is dealt a number of cards. Through the different games, those cards get interchanged. They get used in different ways.
Yeah, but tell me about the GMing part.
That's the thing. It's up to it depends on the game you choose. Usually, when you choose in your own game, you do have some not authority, but you have some responsibilities when setting up the scene or the situation or whatever, but it's very soft. Like, I'm going to choose one at random. Let's see what we have here. And the chase. Yeah, the chase. you are chasing someone. Choose one of the other players to be your counterpart in the chase. Decide together which of you is the hunter and which is the quarry, and how the chase began. And there's a few things like each one draws a card. You ask each other, how do you look to meet? What's your mood? The other players may be present, and then after that is very much depending on the game. So in this case, there's turns, and in your turn you lead the quarry, and there's challenges and setbacks. So it's very depends a lot on each game. There's always a little bit of, okay, decide together the circumstances of the thing that you're doing, like who is present and why are you here, and then it's very much up to the individual game to distribute what happens.
Okay, so but that proceeds in turns. The person who says what game it is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So so there's, again, I'm seeing a lot less diversity in the basic concept than one might think. Mm-hmm. The basic concept really isn't very difficult. But when we look at Polaris, right? So when we look at this one, there's kind of an interesting thing in that everybody at the table has a protagonist, and it moves around turn to turn, around the circle. And the important thing is that the person, ideally you play with 4. The person opposite you is always playing everything in the situation that's antagonistic to you. Then the other 2 people to right and left have very specific roles. This one plays like the other characters, supporting characters. This one does something else. They're called the moons. So but then it moves to the next person and everything kind of switches. Now this person plays. So everybody, ideally, everybody's going to be playing a protagonist. Everybody's going to be playing, the mistaken, it's called, the antagonistic role. And everybody's going to be playing, sooner or later, we'll be playing one of the moons. So, you go around like that. And it is kind of interesting in how utterly kind of fixed it is. And I think that's something that people may actually have been a little put off by when they played, was just how fixed what you do is. It feels very clockworky. But on the other hand, it didn't run into a lot of the kind of freezing up and kind of chaotic play that sometimes occurs with this stuff. So that's one reason why I bring it up, was that it was an attempt to put as much order into the changing, as it could. It's okay if changing up this GMing thing, redistributing this GMing thing is considered to be a somewhat chaotic or a chaos introducing device, then we're going to make sure that it doesn't. That everything else about it is very, very ordered. Whether that's even necessary is a good question, but if you're looking for a game that has no way for that kind of deer in the headlights effect to occur, it's, because playing the antagonist is really easy. All you have to do is find out what the person is doing, and everything is wrong with these characters' lives. It's not hard, to just sort of pick whatever it is going to be. And the moons make enough decisions that you can play the characters as the mistaken without feeling responsible for the scene as a whole, which I think that's really where the structural solidity of Polaris comes from. So all that said, what am I doing with Cosmic Zap? And what I'm doing, because Gordon and Ihel are both playing this, what I'm doing is starting with one character. There is a game master who doesn't have a character. But starting with one character in the session, the game master basically brings it on for that character. But then, after whatever contest is going to occurs, or maybe lack thereof, then that player picks another player, and there's actually an order. So it's not like that. I said pick, that's not true. They go after, their target, their next person, and they have a choice. They can either do what the GM did, which was to find out what that character is doing and then use intrinsic things to problematize it, or they can have whatever happened in their scene come in and knock that scene all awry. And that may involve including characters that were in that previous scene, including their own, or it may not. But the idea being that you can make what is going on for this character very much the consequence of what just happened for that character, or you can basically say nope, page turn, new splash page. What are you doing? And sort of start over. In our first session, it was a good example of pure continuity. Every single player chose to just keep running with what just happened, and so their character, or the character they targeted, was basically having their life, disrupted by the very first scene. It just kept going. It just kept snowballing character after character. And each player chose to have their character come along for the ride.
Yeah.
So by the end of the session, all the characters were in one place coping with some heinous, multifaceted problem, the very fabric of time and space, Herman, we're being ripped asunder. But that was just the first session. After the birth of the goddess, stuff happens. Yeah, after all that happens. And we're playing the second...
Extinction of the human race temporarily held off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Also, the Earth wasn't consumed by a nascent sun.
That's right.
In the middle of it, so pretty okay.
Good day.
Yeah. I mean, it's all one to me. Destroying the Earth in the first couple of scenes happens in these stories, that... So I was okay with it. But then the second session, and Ihel wasn't there for that. Mm-hmm. In the second session, it was precisely the opposite. We had 3 players, and each player had an entirely self-enclosed scene. And in that case, the player coming in saying, or the new GMing player, basically was almost completely on their own relative to that character. So we had a set of fairly isolated scenes that were much more about the personal perspective of each character and their backstory. And of course, play can go anywhere in between these two extremes, just depending on what the players do. Also, what's the Game Master for? The Game Master is actually backstopping each player who's doing this. Once the player says, okay, it's going to be this kind of thing going on with your character, chooses the ability that's being used to kind of attack that character, then they don't have to GM anymore. And especially when there's more than one player character in the situation, it becomes kind of important for the GM to say, okay, all right, I see this ability coming in at that ability. I see that ability coming in at this ability. Do we have 2 sides here with different player characters on each side? Do we have all the player characters up against some particular element that is active, which is the way it worked in our first session? But do you guys see, Gordon and Ihel, how it could have been certain circumstances could actually have put like 2 of the characters against 2 of the other characters? I mean, that can work out. That can happen.
Yeah.
So the GM is just kind of the person who's keeping an eye on all of that and going, okay, guys, wait, this is up against that, remember?
That was the trickiest part of the first session, was when we did all coalesce. Okay, how do we resolve?
Right.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Whereas
The
Right,
first time
right.
I didn't know like what was
There
going
was a
on.
lot less of that. There was
Right.
a lot less of that.
Well, I made up the
How
document.
to resolve as a problem.
I had not passed out my little helpful document for the first session.
Yeah.
And so I sent the little helpful document for the first session about how you actually resolve contests. So that's there.
Yeah.
So we had that for the second session. What we didn't have for the second session is what we're talking about tonight. Which we now used badly, or at least somewhat haphazardly, but I finally have written it out as a document now, what I just described. And it's actually kind of interesting. After that first scene in the session, because that's the easy one, and the GM does that one. Let's say Herman's character was the one who was targeted.
Right.
So your character has undergone some sort of contest with one ability on your own sheet actually set at odds with another ability on your own sheet. And the other interesting thing about that is that they could even be the same ability. Because some of the abilities are actually well set up to do that. And then another twist on it is that there's an ability on your sheet which is due to be damaged or privileged based on how this comes out. And that could be a completely third-party ability relative to what's attacking and what's defending. Or it could be one of those two. So you see, Angel, that's where you were running into trouble is, wait, what is, what's against what, And that makes sense because I was being real. You can see in my new document that it's actually pretty weird. You could be coming after a player and say, what are you doing and what ability are you using to do it with? And the player tells you. Then you say, aha, that other ability on your sheet is messing with you and this is how. So, and it's targeting that ability you just said. So by saying what ability you're using, you kind of put one of your abilities out there as sort of the sacrificial lamb, because obviously it's active and is available to be, damaged. So we've got the attacking ability off your sheet. We've got the victim or the targeted ability on your sheet. Then that player says what ability is going to defend it. So now we've got the attacking and the defending ability. That's where we've got that cosmic, personal, super triangle that I keep talking about. Because cosmic has an advantage over super, super has an advantage over personal, personal has an advantage over cosmic. So that triangle kicks in and we've got some hero point playing on that basis. Then when we run the resolution, then we see, what happens. Is the targeted ability damaged or not? That sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Toss in more characters into this, and all of these things are crisscrossing.
Yeah.
Every single contest has what I just described in it. So, but back to the tricky part, let's just say we're dealing with one player character. You realize we could just be talking about one ability playing all three roles. Potentially. Or you can go all the way, and it's three different abilities completely, which frankly is a little easier to understand, and I would treat kind of as the default before we get weird. Yeah. It's weird enough already. But so then the GMing part then is the sort of lieutenant GMing, I'm calling it, sort of the local GM, is when you've done your thing and now you know who's up next. Next up in line is Angel. Mm-hmm. And you look at what just happened and now you decide whether you're going to do it intrinsically, just like got done to you, or whether you're going to continue what just happened into, you say to Angel, what's your character? What's he doing? If he's not already there. What's he doing? And Angel says, you know what? I'm doing this. So do you see it's kind of interesting? And I just realized, even if the character was already there in that situation, that character does have the power to say, okay, 10 days later, I'm over here. So even though you're the GM in terms of what's going to attack that character, that player is the GM in terms of the scene framing. Mm-hmm. Remember I asked Alex, what are you doing? And he told me that he was hanging out with his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend.
Yep.
So the thing that I'm getting at is that this is really GM-ful, right? I got to start coming up with some vocabulary for this. Herman, having just endured God knows what with his character's contest, turns to Angel and says, "What is your character doing?" And Angel frames his character into a scene, including whatever ability they're using. But then Herman decides how this is problematized with some other ability, whether it's some situation from that prior scene or something off of Angel's sheet. But what's important about that is that it's not just picking, you're actually saying what's happening when you're doing it. So you are more framing. You're framing some more. And then
Angel picks a defense.
Right. Which is, what does my character do? A lot of as you saw during play, this is all very role play-y.
Yeah.
It's easy. You just say what your character does, and you're like, oh, well, it's obviously that,
Yeah.
And so it's not like you have to pick off the sheet, off the menu so much.
But,
then
obviously we've had limited experience so far.
Right.
The thing that seems really neat is that it then goes to you to resolve when that happens. I think that makes what Herman, in this case, an example of what Herman was doing, less burdensome.
Right, because Herman doesn't have to decide when we go to the dice.
He doesn't have to figure that out.
Right. I mean, the GM is there to kind of backstop when we go to the dice and, who's up against who based on who said what. And so Herman can sort of problematize, like a kid in a candy store, knowing that you don't have to keep all this shit in mind. Someone else is taking care of, the buttons. And so that's kind of what I have in mind. And I am a little shocked at both sessions so far, haphazard and like me trying to figure out my notion for the system on the fly as it was. It worked.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon, you were there for both.
Yep, no, that's what I was saying. Limited experience so far, but it looks like that process really feels like a good way of managing the sharing of that GM-ishness.
That's kind of what I was going at, because I have to tell you, I felt like I was done. That I'd had enough. Like Jared, like Vincent, I have a lot of enjoyment in a relative centralization of GMing. With a lot of power for players. Sorcerer, Trollbabe, Circle of Hands, there's a lot of player agency in where I go and what I do, forcing the GM to work with the scene that is, absolutely necessitated by what the player said. So it's not utterly controlling GMing, but it's still, I will tell you what the log cabin looks like. I will tell you, who's there and what they think. The backstory's mine. You're not making up a whole lot in backstory. So, and Spiona and Shahida, to me, are as far as I want to go in the other direction. And I think they go very far, and I think they do it well. But they are definitely, I was like, okay, I'm going to save that kind of design for my weird stuff, the political stuff, the religious stuff, where I just let the experimental unconscious go and don't even, often, am in an intuitive state for a lot of the game design. Whereas here I was saying, I'm done with that shit. This is a GM game. What am I going to do? And then it struck me that, I'm going to borrow this from GM Full Games. Mm-hmm. We're gonna try and, for purposes of this game and its qualities, we can do interesting things. Number one, you can have missing players, and the procedures do not change. You can have continuity, and you can have lack of continuity, and both help. You can have characters running into each other consequentially, which is exactly what you need, in these games. Right now, my next step is how do we build powerful entities with goals based on what has happened? What do I do with Diamonds now that she's a young goddess? What do I do? Is she still just an ability on Alex's sheet?
Right.
And or do I build her and his relationship remains? What's that, Gordon?
And in a lot of ways, you don't want to take her away from him.
Right. So that ability on his sheet, the relationship in and of itself, is going to remain no matter what. Now, the next question is, what do I do? Do I have what procedure do I have? And I want to use the contests that we run as a mechanism for doing that. That now I can attach a new ability to Diamonds that's not under Alex's control.
Yeah.
Based on the outcome of that. It was a marginal victory. She got a marginal victory over everybody in that big-ass conflict. So that's worth a 3. A +3. Okay. I'm going to give her, I can either make, I can't make the ability bigger. That's Alex's sheet. He's got to use his own hero points for that. But I can take that and make that an ability of hers that is mine. So, and
they're tied to the GM or to the story or to something that's not
right.
character.
Right. And what's kind of fun about that is that all of a sudden, this is how you get Thanos. From a completely B villain in Iron Man to, a cosmic player of consequence.
And it felt pretty natural with a character that she will kind of
absolutely
take from the player's ability and build her own. Because I think even in the fiction, she was born from my misdirected power or something like that. Right.
Well, she stole the power of the star that you were, birthing or destroying or whatever the hell it was you were doing with that star.
Yeah.
And then exactly, and there she was in the middle of like the time flux and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, we did awful things to the 21st century. You missed it. No, 22nd, right, Gordon?
22nd century.
Right. With the 22nd century has turned out to be a really strange place. That's just all I gotta say.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking yesterday is how does the game deal with what we were talking before of going from conflict to conflict all the time?
Well, the idea being that the shift is that the contests are either continuous, springboarding from the previous scene, or they're not. And so are you asking, can a person have a scene where no contest comes up?
Maybe, or the answer I came up yesterday kind of think is that personal can be seen as a contest, but it's not can be used as a refresher. Having a personal conflict can lower the stakes, but they still make it very impactful.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can have a scene which is just all conducted with abilities in the personal sphere, keyword, and I mean, you could. That's even like the characters just hanging out and meditating a little bit, and they say, and then the other player says, you know what, I think your self-doubt's going to attack you.
Yeah. I was thinking that.
Yeah, technically nothing happens. But in terms of the mechanics, he's either going to have a +3 or a -3 to his ability, or worse, depending on how the conflict turns out.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and in that sense, I mean, so it always opens with what are you doing, tie it to an ability, and then attack it.
Right.
It might be interesting to have, degrees of attack, or maybe you don't need to always be going for a major gun.
It kind of depends. Yeah, it kind of depends on what the attack will do. If all the attack will do is reduce that ability a little bit because of its intrinsic properties of what it is, then it's all just a matter of how much you want to color it. I mean, what is the self-doubt? I mean, the ability to describe the self-doubt's kind of interesting.
Well, yeah, and I think you can probably trust people to kind of, pace themselves a little bit and not always make, I'm going to attack you and what's at stake is the end of the universe.
Actually, I don't know if you can trust them. I think we have to teach. I think we have to tell them.
But I also like since the player, the one that is the scene is that is going to be attacked. Since he's saying, they are saying what they are doing, they can be saying, yeah, I'm in the middle of a forest, just meditating.
Right.
So they can say, yeah, I don't really want to go for the big comic.
Right. I'm not going to have the heavens open and the Antichrist come get you this time.
Or I'm working and doing my delivery job or whatever.
Right. Might be kind of fun to just watch you in your delivery job. And so it's a nice interplay between the players in terms of what that's and what's kind of nice about the GM role, I don't have to worry about that at all.
Yeah. I think that's probably the answer, but we'll see how it goes in play. But that's how I feel it could work.
That's the theory at the moment, to keep it going, and also that since the material is sufficiently operatic, when you want it to go crazy,
it's okay.
You go right ahead.
It goes crazy.
Yeah. You go right ahead, and it's fine. And so it's what I like to, what I'm calling it? I'm calling it irresponsible play.
Because of the responsibility. I like that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. You can play irresponsibly. If you just want to see how the guy's doing on his milkman route, you can. If you want to have the heavens open and the Antichrist attack, you can.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both on the sheet, man. They're both on the sheet.
And it goes a little bit about the idea of responsibilities.
Yeah.
And everyone has a fixed responsibility.
Right, but you don't have the responsibilities you don't have, and so you don't have to take care of anybody in that regard. You can be completely irresponsible about, what way what's that going to do to the story? And you're like, I don't care.
Yeah.
So I think that's that the Hero Quest system so far in Glorantha has often had a somewhat portentous role for the narrator. It's a Robin Laws design. And Robin likes his GM authorities. And so, therefore, I find myself sometimes reading the narrator rules, a little skeptically. You're like, really? That seems, do I have to do that? I can just ask the player, I don't have to do that. And so I'm kind of taking some of the mechanics in that system under a slightly different philosophy of where story comes from. Sort of my idea.
That's why I think it really fits the spirit of the game. If you want to go cosmic.
Yeah.
Like if you have characters that can harvest the power of the sun or whatever bullshit you came up with. You don't have to worry about
wander to whatever century they want to, and that kind of thing. Yeah. The interesting thing is going to be, where are the climactic points? What is at stake? What do we care about? And what's interesting about these kinds of comics is that those usually became very philosophically heartfelt. And so whether that emerges through play because we start to care, is interesting to me. And I don't think you can force that. I'm going to have to see whether I, as the GM, am doing something that helps keep our eye on that ball. That's, because if I'm doing it and I don't know it, then what I put on paper as game design isn't actually going to be, doing what it's supposed to.
There's more games which have that.
That you read and it's like half the game is missing.
Right.
I'm sure you were playing in your house, but in the text, half of it is missing.
A great deal of them have to do with that scene framing step, and people who say, "Well, that's just GMing." And you're kind of going, yeah, but I'm sure you're right. But the question is, what is it actually? What is it that you do? And that's why I'm aiming at that particular thing in this design, because that, frankly, in the HeroQuest system is not there.
We have a big advantage with our Cosmic Zap, which is that, you know, wild ass framing is perfectly cool.
Right.
So we don't even need to worry about, like, wait a minute, you know, this doesn't make sense. Lorenthans wouldn't do that or whatever.
Right. Right. There's
so we can avoid some of the difficulties with just because of the setting.
And each character is reasonably rich. I mean, one thing I kind of like is you're kind of curious about, you got all that shit all over your sheet. I'm going to go pick something we haven't seen yet. You know,
exactly.
there's 20 terms on that sheet. You got plenty of room. You know, I'm going to go throw a dart and hit something on your sheet and go, ooh, you know.
Yeah, like I don't know what half of the shit I read.
That's right. Exactly, because we all were just, you know, we were all spitballing anyway. I'm sorry, Gordon, did we interrupt you for a second?
Well, no, I was just going to say, and what we've seen so far, though, even given all that, is that there's enough to grab onto with, okay, you have to pick an ability, and it's going to start here and move to this person. And there's enough there that even though you might argue that it comes that the what works about the scene setting comes from the setting more than the process, I'm not willing to make that claim now, because it feels like the process sure
yeah, I think there's some process in there. I'll be
really seem to be helping.
I will also be a little curious. There's several system features that I'm still, you know, kind of skeptical of, or kind of uncertain about how well they're going to work or do work. It's going to be kind of interesting when really heavy consequences start to occur. Either heavy consequences to settings or heavy consequences to characters. You know, you can die, and their death is a piece of this game. So systemically, so I'm kind of curious about those.
Another thing I was thinking is that I'm interested about is how that you have this fun task now of deciding how to label things in the game. If you want to take the GM term and kind of say, yeah, this is GMing, but or you want to ban the mother load down. And
that's right. Say no. There's one GM. Oh, by the way, the player does this, and then don't mention that that's not what players ordinarily do.
Yeah, or just there's no GM. We are done with that bullshit.
Right, right.
And that's a whole topic of dealing with the idea of the GM.
Yeah, the interesting thing for this game, and considering that the HeroQuest audience is an existing thing, it's best to say just call the one person the GM, and then just have rules for what the players do at certain times.
Yeah, I think
and the fact that that's actually GMing in a lot of ways, so part of it, we need not mention that. You know, it's something the player gets to do. So yeah, that's part of it. Anyway, thanks for listening to me about that. It helps kind of talk it out, and say, okay, I'm over that part of the design. Let's just keep playing with it. Now we have other problems in the design to work with. Thanks for joining me, as usual.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Good night.
Thanks again.
Yeah, take care.